There is a theory, quiet, almost invisible, the way the best theories are, that every empire runs not on ideology, not on fear, not even on money. It runs on silence, not the silence of empty rooms, the silence of men who were there. Men who sat 3 feet from history while it was still being made, who breathed the same stale air as the men who decided the fate of nations, who watched in the rearview mirror as the architecture of an entire civilization was quietly rearranged, and who said nothing for decades, for most of their lives. Vladimir Ryzhikov was one of those men. For 13 years of early mornings, encrypted radio channels, unmarked routes through a city that never fully slept. He sat behind the wheel of a car that, from the outside, looked like any other vehicle on the streets of Moscow. He drove one of the most powerful and most feared men in Soviet history. He heard conversations that were never meant to be heard. He witnessed meetings that were never meant to be seen. He carried secrets in the architecture of his memory, brick by brick, year by year, until the weight of them had become simply the weight of his ordinary life. His name was Yuri Andropov, chairman of the KGB General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The man who, many historians now believe, came closer than anyone else to genuinely reforming the unreformable. Ryzhikov drove him everywhere, and for 40 years, he told no one. This is what he finally said. Vladimir Ryzhikov did not apply for the job. This is the first thing you need to understand about how the machinery of Soviet power actually worked at its deepest levels. The men who kept its most sensitive gears turning were never recruited through advertisements, never found through referrals, never hired through interviews in the conventional sense of the word. They were identified, quietly, patiently. The way a jeweler identifies a stone worth cutting, not by its shine, but by its internal structure, by the way it holds light without scattering it. Ryzhikov had been a border guard. 2 years on the Finnish frontier, then 3 more in the mountainous terrain of the Soviet-Afghan border region. Long before that border became the name of a tragedy. He was known among his commanders for 2 qualities that rarely coexist in the same man: exceptional reflexes and exceptional stillness. He could react to a crisis in less than a second, and then, when the crisis had passed, become so quiet that the men around him sometimes forgot he was there. Someone noticed. In the Soviet system of that era, someone always noticed. In the spring of 1969, Ryzhikov received transfer orders with no explanation attached. He was sent to Moscow, to a garage, not a famous garage, not a garage with a plaque or a name or a sign of any kind. A building on a street that had no reason to be notable, staffed by men who had no reason to be memorable, operating under an administrative designation so vague it would have been forgotten by anyone who read it once. This was the Special Purpose Garage, operating under the direct authority of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It existed to move power from one place to another, quietly, securely, invisibly. Ryzhikov reported at 7 in the morning. By 7:15, he understood that he had entered a different world. The selection process lasted 4 days. There were 12 men in Ryzhikov's group. They were given almost no information about what they were being selected for. They were watched. They were observed eating, sleeping, waiting in corridors. They were placed in rooms where conversations happened just loudly enough to be overheard. And the content of those conversations was designed to be interesting, provocative even. They were given small tasks that seemed meaningless, and were, in fact, the entire test. The formal interview, when it finally came, lasted 40 minutes and contained almost no questions about driving. The man across the table, whose name Ryzhikov would not learn for another 2 years, asked about his family, his father's profession, his mother's health, whether he had close friends from his military service, whether he enjoyed talking, whether he found silence uncomfortable, what he did when he was bored, whether he had ever, in his life, been asked to keep a secret and whether he had kept it. Then came the question. It was asked casually, in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, and if you were not paying close attention, you might have missed its weight. Ryzhikov did not hesitate. Quote 1, he said, He was selected the following morning. Of 30 candidates who entered the training program, 8 completed it. This number is not presented to impress, it is presented because the mathematics of it matter. 22 men who had already been screened, already been selected from a much larger pool, already been judged worthy of consideration, were found after 6 months to be insufficient, not dangerous, not corrupt, simply insufficient for the particular demands of what this work required. The training was structured around 6 disciplines. The first was psychological. The instructors called it __, quote, _2__. But what they actually meant was something more precise. Learning to be present without registering, to occupy a space without disturbing it, to sit in a room where powerful men are speaking, and to become, in the minds of those men, as unremarkable as the furniture. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the most demanding psychological disciplines a human being can undertake. The natural human instinct is to be noticed, to participate, to react. Suppressing that instinct completely, day after day, year after year, requires a restructuring of the self that most people are not capable of. The second was technical. Every vehicle in the fleet had to be understood completely. Not as a driver understands a car, but as a surgeon understands the body he's operating on. Every mechanical system, every failure mode, every sound that should not be heard, and what it meant. The third was emergency driving. The program used a closed track outside the city. Candidates learned to execute a full reverse direction turn at 150 kilometers per hour. They learned pursuit evasion, controlled collision avoidance, high-speed navigation through urban environments without lights. They were timed again. Then they were timed while a man in the back seat shouted at them. The fourth was weapons training, not to the level of a field operative, but close. A driver who could not protect his passenger in the critical seconds before reinforcement arrived was a liability. Ryzhikov qualified at a level that exceeded the requirement. The fifth was field medicine, stabilization, not surgery. How to keep a man alive for 12 minutes. How to use a defibrillator. How to manage certain types of trauma in the backseat of a moving vehicle with nothing but what was already in the car. The sixth, and the one the graduates would later say was the most valuable, was observation. Not surveillance in the spy's sense, but human observation. How does this man sit when he's worried? How does that man's voice change when he's lying? What does a person look like when they are about to make a decision they will regret? The instructors brought in actors. They brought in real officials. Sometimes the candidates were told afterward the people they had been watching were not actors at all. 8 men completed all 6 disciplines at the required standard. Ryzhikov was one of them. Before he was trusted with anyone important, Ryzhikov spent 3 years driving mid-level officials. He understood later that this was itself a test, the longest and most sophisticated test of the entire process. Every assignment was monitored. A supervisor from state security reviewed his conduct after every shift. Classified folders were occasionally __, quote, _3, __ in the back seat. Sensitive conversations were held at volumes calibrated to be just barely audible to the driver. Officials occasionally asked him directly what he had heard. His answer was always the same, not quote 4. That would have been implausible and therefore suspicious. His answer was a look, a small, puzzled look, as if the question itself were slightly confusing, as if the idea that he might have been listening had simply never occurred to him because he had been watching the road. One evening in late autumn, he arrived at an office building to collect a deputy minister and found on the back seat a leather folder sealed with an official classification stamp. He did not open it. He did not look at it again. He drove to the ministry, handed it to a guard at the entrance, and filed a report noting that classified material had been left unattended in a government vehicle. The next morning, he was reassigned to the Central Committee pool. When the call came on a Tuesday, the date was in early spring of 1972, he was told to study 4 routes, not to memorize them, to know them. to know every traffic light pattern, every intersection that tended to back up between 7 and 8 in the morning, every alternate route that could save 4 minutes without adding visible distance to the journey. He was given a thin file with behavioral notes. His new passenger disliked sudden braking. He valued punctuality with an almost physical intensity. Not close, not approximately, but exact. He preferred silence but did not require it. He noticed everything. Ryzhikov spent 2 weeks preparing. The first morning came with rain. He arrived at the building on Kutuzovsky Prospect 14 minutes early and waited with the engine off. At precisely the agreed time, the door opened. The man who walked toward the car was lean, contained, wearing glasses with plain frames. He moved with the careful economy of someone who has long since stopped wasting energy on anything unnecessary. He got into the back seat. He placed his briefcase on his knee. He looked for exactly 2 seconds at the back of Ryzhikov's head. Then he said 4 words. "To the Lubyanka," quickly. Ryzhikov pulled into the street without a word. He knew the route. He had studied this particular route 17 times in the preceding 2 weeks, at different hours, in different weather. He drove it now without consulting anything. No notes, no hesitation, no unnecessary speed, no delay. He arrived at the building at the exact time the calculation demanded. Andropov got out without speaking. 1 month later, Ryzhikov found a temporary roadblock on the primary route and rerouted through a parallel street, a decision he made in 4 seconds, without instruction, without informing his passenger. They arrived at the destination with 60 seconds to spare. As Andropov stepped out of the car, he paused. He did not turn around. "Good," he said. That was the entire conversation. It was enough. From the outside, the car was a Gaz 24 Volga, black. Unremarkable, the kind of vehicle you saw dozens of times a day on the streets of Moscow without registering it, because it was designed to be registered and immediately forgotten. From the inside, it was something else entirely. The engine had been rebuilt from the factory specification upward. 160 horsepower and a body that nothing about its exterior suggested. The frame carried armor plating calibrated to absorb impact without compromising the vehicle's handling profile. The glass, and this was the detail that Ryzhikov would describe decades later with quiet pride, as if it still amazed him, the glass could hold a full burst from a Kalashnikov assault rifle fired from 50 meters. The windows looked ordinary. They were not ordinary. The car carried 3 complete sets of license plates. A driver trained in the relevant technique could perform a full plate change in under 2 minutes without exiting the vehicle. In the center console, below a panel that looked like part of the standard interior, there was a small lockbox. It opened to a single fingerprint only. In 1972, this was technology that existed in practical application in approximately 4 places in the Soviet Union. There was a radio system with built-in encryption. There was a medical kit that went considerably beyond what any standard first responder would carry. There were no lights on the roof, no sirens, no markings of any kind. This was a specific choice, Ryzhikov learned later. A philosophical one as much as a practical one. Andropov had said it directly to one of his deputies in a meeting that Ryzhikov was not supposed to have heard, but did. Quote 7. The weekly rhythm settled into its own logic within the first several months. Mondays arrived with an almost aggressive density. Calls from regional offices, new crises requiring immediate meetings. The compressed urgency of a week that had not yet found its shape. Tuesdays were for departmental visits, the slower machinery of middle management, the particular grind of institutional oversight. Wednesdays belonged to the KGB Collegium, the formal, procedural center of Andropov's official authority. Thursdays meant the Central Committee building, sometimes the Kremlin itself, the heaviest gravity in the entire system. Fridays were unpredictable in a way that the other days were not, as if the week itself had exhausted its capacity for order and simply produced whatever remained. Ryzhikov learned to read the day before it started by the way Andropov sat down, the angle of the shoulders, whether the briefcase went on the seat or on the knee, whether he looked out the window in the first 30 seconds or opened a document immediately. Whether he was still or whether he had that particular quality of controlled tension that meant the day was already wrong before it began. He learned these things the way you learn to read weather, not from any single signal, but from the pattern of many signals together, accumulated over seasons, until the reading became instinctive and the instinct became reliable. His own appearance was managed with the same precision he brought to everything else. Gray-blue clothing, nothing that caught light, nothing with texture that the eye wanted to follow. The goal, as his trainers had described it years earlier, was not to be invisible. That was impossible. The goal was to be expected, to be so completely consistent with the visual grammar of the space you occupied that the eye passed over you the way it passes over a familiar piece of furniture. He was the driver. He was always there. He was never noticed. This was, he would say 40 years later, the hardest thing he ever learned to do. And it was, by his own account, the thing that brought him closer to the center of Soviet power than almost anyone else of his generation, because the rule of that world, the rule that held across every level of the system, from the lowest clerk to the highest secretary, was this: you only speak freely when you believe no one important is listening. Vladimir Ryzhikov was always listening. He just never let anyone know. There's a particular quality to a telephone ringing at 2 in the morning that is unlike any other sound. In an ordinary life, it means catastrophe, illness, accident, someone you love in sudden trouble. In Ryzhikov's life, it meant something else entirely. It meant the city was about to show him one of its hidden faces. The protocol never changed. One ring, then silence, then one ring again. That was the signal. Not the number of rings, the pause between them. He would be dressed and at the wheel in under 5 minutes. The clothing was laid out every night on the chair beside the bed in a fixed order: trousers, shirt, jacket, shoes. Not because he had been told to do this, because after the first year it had become impossible to sleep any other way. Nighttime Moscow in the 1970s was a city that most of its residents had never seen. The official city, the one with its broad lit avenues and its monuments and its careful pedestrian rhythms, went quiet after 11. But there was another city underneath it, and that city never stopped moving. It moved in black cars through streets that emptied themselves with suspicious convenience. It moved through gates that opened before the car reached them and closed before anyone on the street could look twice. It moved through Moscow's old residential districts, where pre-revolutionary mansions had been quietly reassigned to purposes that appeared nowhere in any public document. Ryzhikov drove through this second city for 13 years. The routes were never repeated. This was not carelessness, it was principle. The same principle that governed every aspect of Andropov's movement. Predictability was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities were unacceptable. So every route was calculated fresh, and Ryzhikov, who had by then memorized the city's street grid with the completeness of a surgeon memorizing anatomy, navigated it the way a chess player navigates a board. 3 moves ahead, always. The most memorable of the night journeys came in November of 1974, 2 nights consecutive. A road leading out of the city, not the main highway, but a secondary road that followed the river. A village, or what had once been a village, in a cleared stretch of trees. Several cars were already there when they arrived, dark, without plates, parked at angles that suggested they had come from different directions. No lights except what leaked through curtain windows. Andropov went in alone and stayed for hours. When he came back to the car, just before dawn, his face carried an expression that Ryzhikov had not seen before and would not see again until many years later, during a completely different set of circumstances. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was closer to the expression of a man who has received a confirmation he was both hoping for and dreading. He said nothing on the drive back. Ryzhikov asked nothing. They arrived at the apartment on Kutuzovsky as the city was beginning its first cautious movements toward morning. Over 13 years, Ryzhikov drove dozens of people he was never introduced to and never asked to identify. 3 of them he would remember with particular precision when he finally spoke about those years in 2010. The first was a man who appeared every Tuesday at the same metro station near the University District. He was always waiting at the same place, and not at the entrance, but 20 meters from it near a specific bench. He had the kind of face that does not photograph well, in the sense that no single feature was remarkable enough to anchor a description. He spoke to Andropov in a language that Ryzhikov could not identify with certainty from the front seat. Something with a rhythm unlike Russian, possibly from Central Asia, possibly not. The conversations were always brief. The man would be dropped at a different location each time, and each time he would walk away without looking back. Approximately 6 months after these Tuesday meetings ended, a significant counterintelligence operation concluded successfully in the Central Asian region of the Soviet Union. The connection was never officially stated. It was not necessary to state it. The second was a woman, younger than Ryzhikov had expected to see in a car with Andropov at that hour. She was collected from the Belaruski railway terminal on a rainy Thursday night and taken to an apartment building in the so-called neighborhood. She sat with absolute stillness in the back seat, in the way that people sit when they are managing something that would otherwise overwhelm them. She was not brought back. 3 months later, a foreign intelligence network operating in West Germany was exposed and dismantled. Again, no official connection was drawn. Again, it was not necessary. The third was an old man from somewhere far outside the city. He arrived in Moscow only once, as far as Ryzhikov knew, and Andropov received him with a deference that was unusual enough to notice. Not the formal deference of a subordinate, something older and more personal. They sat together for almost 2 hours in a room while Ryzhikov waited in the car. When they came out, the old man said something quietly. Ryzhikov caught only the last sentence. He would remember it precisely until the end of his life. The old man said, "Archives don't burn, not even the ones that were set on fire." He died within the year. Shortly after his death, a new department was quietly established within the KGB. Its purpose, according to those who later described it, was the systematic documentation of institutional memory through oral testimony. Interviews with aging operatives, conversations recorded and classified before the people who held the knowledge died and took it with them. The old man, whoever he was, had apparently made an argument that was found convincing. The Dasha had a screening room. 50 square meters, 12 rows of seats, a white wall in place of a formal screen, a projector of East German manufacture. The room smelled of the particular combination of old upholstery and mechanical oil that screening rooms everywhere seem to accumulate over time. Andropov used it, but not in the way screening rooms are normally used. He would enter, sit, watch for between 10 and 15 minutes, sometimes less, and then leave for his study. The projector would continue running. Ryzhikov, who had learned to position himself in the corridor, where the reflection of the screen was partially visible through the door, eventually began to track which films were shown and when. The pattern took about 8 months to become clear. In the weeks before, significant personnel decisions, promotions, dismissals, the subtle restructuring of authority that happened constantly at that level of the system. The films shown were about betrayal, not dramatic betrayal necessarily. Films about the quiet kind. The kind where a man who seems trustworthy turns out to have been serving something else all along. Before large operational decisions, the film shifted to wartime material. Not propaganda, realistic wartime material, the kind that showed logistics and coordination and the things that go wrong when command structures fail. In periods of institutional crisis, when the system itself seemed to be under pressure from forces it hadn't anticipated, the films were about collapsed empires, Roman, Byzantine, the great powers of the 19th century that went from dominance to irrelevance in the span of a generation. 17 Moments of Spring, the Soviet television serial about a spy operating undercover in the final years of the Second World War, was shown 3 times, not the full series. Only the episodes concerning a specific agent's exposure, the precise sequence of mistakes that led to it. The moment when a man who had been invisible for years suddenly became visible. After the third viewing, which came in the spring of 1979, there were significant staff changes within several KGB directorates. Ryzhikov never mentioned the pattern to anyone until 2010. By then, most of the people who might have understood its implications were already gone. Andropov's wife was named Tatiana. She was, by every account of those who knew the family before the KGB years, an exceptional woman, educated, multilingual, capable of the kind of precise and elegant conversation that was rare in those circles. She had translated documents in 3 languages. She had, in her early years with Andropov, been the more socially fluent of the two. By the time Ryzhikov began driving, something in her had quietly collapsed. He saw her perhaps a dozen times over 13 years, and each time the collapse was a little more visible. Not dramatically. Nothing in that world was dramatic in the way that stories make things dramatic. It was quieter than that. The way certain buildings show their age, not through any single crack, but through an accumulation of small surrenders to gravity. There was one evening, a formal reception at the Kremlin, winter of 1976, when she appeared in a state that made Andropov, for the first and only time in Ryzhikov's observation, lose something of his composure, not in front of others. He maintained the surface perfectly, as he always did. But in the car afterward, in the silence of the drive home, he sat differently than he normally sat. After a long time, apparently forgetting that he was not alone, he spoke. "I can manage thousands of people," he said, "and I cannot help the one person who's closest to me." He never referred to it again. Ryzhikov never mentioned it to anyone until it was almost too late to matter. Brezhnev's state residence was outside the city on a road that Ryzhikov had memorized in his first week with Andropov. They went 2 or 3 times a month, usually in the morning. By the mid-1970s, Brezhnev's health had become a carefully managed performance. The man who greeted visitors in public carried himself with the formal weight of a general secretary. The man Ryzhikov occasionally glimpsed at those private meetings was something more human and considerably more fragile. He moved carefully. He tired quickly. He sometimes lost the thread of complex sentences and had to be gently redirected. But something happened when Andropov arrived, something that Ryzhikov could observe even from a distance. The older man became more present, more alert, more himself, whatever self had survived the decades of accumulated ceremony. They walked together sometimes along the path by the water when the weather allowed. Once, watching from the car, Ryzhikov saw Brezhnev stop and produce a cigarette from somewhere inside his coat. A cheap domestic brand, the kind nobody of his rank was supposed to smoke anymore. He lit it and smoked it quickly, with the guilty pleasure of a man stealing something small back from the machinery of his own dignity, and dropped the end into the water before they turned back toward the house. Andropov returned from these visits quieter than usual. Sometimes on the drive back to the city, he would say something aloud to no one in particular, or perhaps to Ryzhikov, or perhaps simply to the window, to the birch trees moving past in the gray afternoon light. "Time is leaving," he said once. "It is leaving all of us." The apartment existed on no official list. It was registered to a distant relative, a name that meant nothing to anyone looking at it without context. 2 rooms, a small kitchen, furniture from an East German catalog, the kind you ordered through the state store, bookshelves made from unfinished boards. Andropov went there without the security detail, without a telephone, without the apparatus that followed him everywhere else. Ryzhikov would drop him at the corner and wait 3 streets away for as long as it took. Once, the only time this happened, Ryzhikov needed to deliver something urgent and was told to knock. He entered briefly and saw, in the time it took to hand over an envelope and leave the bookshelves, Talleyrand, Metternich, Bismarck, philosophy in German, poetry. A stack of papers on the small table, handwritten in the compressed script of a man who wrote quickly because the thoughts came faster than the pen. He did not read any of it. But years later, when fragments of what Andropov had apparently written during those years were described by historians who had seen partial documents, Ryzhikov recognized one passage from the description alone. It had been on the top of the stack that evening, the ink still relatively fresh. "We built a system stronger than ourselves. Now we are its prisoners. The question is not whether it can be changed. The question is whether any of us will live long enough to change it." The apartment was sealed after the funeral. The papers were removed by a team that arrived before the family. Their location has never been officially confirmed. From 1979 onward, something began to change in the way Andropov carried himself. It was not visible to most people. It was visible to Ryzhikov, who by then had 13 years of the man's posture cataloged in his memory with the completeness of a library. The pauses between sentences grew slightly longer. The precision remained. If anything, it intensified, as if the mind were compensating for what the body was beginning to subtract. But there was a quality of urgency that had not been there before, or had been there but muted. Now it was present in every meeting, every decision, every conversation conducted in the back of a black car, moving through a city that did not know what it was losing. By February of 1983, the kidney failure was total. He was receiving dialysis 3 times a week. Later, every other day. He worked through treatments, documents spread across his knees, continuing to read and annotate as the machine did what his body could no longer do on its own. He became General Secretary in November of 1982. He had 15 months. January 1984. Andropov came to the car with a cane, something Ryzhikov had never seen. He moved slowly but without self-pity, in the way that certain people accept physical limitation as simply another logistical problem to be managed. He asked to go to the dacha. They drove without speaking, the way they had driven thousands of times. The city thinned out behind them, and the road became the road through the birch trees, and then the gate, and then the driveway, and then the familiar stillness of the house in winter. Andropov walked to the screening room. He stood in the doorway for a long moment without going in. He said, not to Ryzhikov, not quite to himself, somewhere between the two. So many films, and I never stayed for the ending of a single one. He died on the 9th of February, 1984. He was 69 years old. 4 people in the entire Soviet leadership were informed on the day it happened. Ryzhikov retired immediately. He received no particular recognition. That was not how the system worked, and he had not expected any. Over the following years, he was approached several times with offers to speak. Western publishers, documentary filmmakers, journalists from countries that were intensely interested for various reasons in what the man who had driven Andropov for 13 years might remember. The offers were substantial. Some were, by the standards of a retired Soviet driver living on a state-gate pension, extraordinary. He declined all of them, not from fear. He was clear about this in the one interview he eventually gave. Not from loyalty to an institution he knew perfectly well was imperfect, but from something that he struggled to name and finally described simply as a sense of what things were worth. The stories he carried had value precisely because they had not been sold. The moment he sold them, they would become something else, entertainment or propaganda or ammunition for arguments he had no interest in. They would cease to be what they actually were, the private record of a private man who had happened to be present at the making of history. In the summer of 2010, he gave 3 days to a historian from Moscow University. Every word was weighed before it was spoken. Every story was given exactly the shape it needed, and no more. He died in 2015, quietly at home during the night. He left no written record, no memoir, no notes, just the interview, now archived somewhere in an institution that prefers not to advertise its holdings, and the memory of a black car moving through the streets of a city that no longer exists, carrying secrets that were never fully told, navigating even now a route that appears on no map, toward a destination that no official document has ever named. The engine, in the memory of those who heard it, makes no sound at all.